Okay, perfect. So like Natalie said, my name is Brittany MacLean. I'm the Corporate and Environmental Performance Officer here at the City of Fredericton. That's a role that I've been in for about 4 or 5 months now. So half of my day is dedicated to our environmental initiatives and projects. I led the development of the city's adaptation plan and community and corporate energy plans, and now I'm working across departments with different staff groups to help implement some of the actions that were in those plans. And the other half of my day is spent on innovation projects and corporate performance. So let's jump into this. So today I want to go over the climate change context of flooding in the city. Obviously, flooding has been happening in our region for a long time, but flooding, climate change is certainly a factor in that at this point in history. I'm going to talk to you about how the city approaches flood mitigation, what we've worked on in the past, what we're working on right now, and where we're headed. So if we talk about climate change, we've seen an over 1 degree temperature increase over the past 30 years in Fredericton, and that is significant. We've seen a 1.5 degree temperature increase over the last century. And it's significant because when we talk about climate change, it happens unevenly, right? So we can still have a really cold winter. Sorry, I just got muted. Really
sorry,
high.
Brittany, that was my fault.
That's okay. We can have a lot of snowpack, or we can have a lot of ice, but then we can see the temperatures rise quickly. We also know that climate change doesn't happen evenly. So we might have a particularly warm year, where up north it might be a colder year. So we may see that snowpack and ice up north, which impacts the spring freshet. So over the last 12 years, of course, we've seen 3 1 in 100 year flood events. I'm just going to clarify for anybody that hears that 1 in 100 year flood event kind of tagline we talk about all the time. What that actually means, it isn't a 1 in 100 year event. It means that each year there's a 1% chance of a flood that severe happening. So that's why we've been able to see 3 in the past 12 years. You've got a 1% chance every year. There's an increase in frequency and severity of extreme weather events. So that includes heavy rainfall events in all seasons. So not only are we at a flood risk from the river, we're at a flood risk, at an overland flood risk, right, from rain events, and those are increasing. So I'll talk about both. Just a little bit more information on the impacts that we're seeing. And of course, so everything plays into the flood model and the flood forecasting, right? We're hoping that the province will have a new model for us based on recent climate change projections. But basically we know, we're gonna see in the summer a 2 to 5 degree increase in temperature by the end of the century, increase in hot nights, increase in length, frequency, and intensity of heat waves. So in the summer, this is important because we see a lot of drying out of the ground, we see a lot of drought, and then we pair that with high intensity rainfall events. So we're seeing an increase in annual precipitation, which will be, it's around 3% right now, but we'll see over a 1980 to 2010 baseline. We're expected to see an almost 9% increase by 2100. If we don't get our act together with decreasing emissions globally, we could see around a 13% increase. So that's significant, especially when we pair that with the idea that there are droughts, and then we see these high intensity events and the ground just doesn't have the capacity to hold it. We're also seeing, just in general, fewer rain days and fewer snow days throughout the year. And again, that just contributes to the fact that when we're having rain, we're having more at one time. And we're also seeing the crossover into a lot more rain and freezing rain events in the winter, which of course is bad when you have frozen ground and then you have a high intensity rainfall event. happening and there's no capacity for the ground to absorb that water. And that's when we see a lot of basement flooding. Yeah, we're going to see increases in temperature in the winter as well. And like I said, that's happening unevenly. So we're kind of sitting in this really difficult period with river flooding where, you know, the snowpack up north might be high where we've had a warmer winter, or we could just see a combination of factors that we wouldn't typically see. And of course, this all increases the potential for river flooding and for overland flooding. I'll talk a little bit about our role here as the city. So basically, the municipality's basic function is to provide services to properties. So that includes everything from roads to stormwater management. And most of our services we learned through the adaptation planning process, and I think we knew it before, is most of our services are impacted directly and indirectly by climate change. So we have both a responsibility and an opportunity to act. And some of the ways that we can help with adaptation as a municipality, and especially on the flooding side, is, you know, we can look at infrastructure renewal and asset management. I'll talk a little bit about the changes we've made to infrastructure over the past 2 decades and how we've kind of brought that right into our asset management planning process. We use bylaws, land use planning, and policies. So one of the bylaws, for an example, is a 9-meter minimum habitable space bylaw, which means you can't build below 9 meters in a flood zone because then your property is at risk. And that's not good for you because your property can flood, and it's also not good for the city because if there were an emergency during a flooding period, the roads are inaccessible, emergency services can't get to you, all of those things. There's some other ways that we can adapt as well around flooding. So service delivery is one. So, you know, we're obviously making a move to online systems, which helps during a flooding period, but also if you've been around Fredericton the last few years when we've had floods, we adapted our public transit model to work with the flooding, and we had park and ride stations and things like that, just to deal with that kind of extended period of flooding that we saw. Leadership, obviously, we talk about this in the sense that there are things that people can do at a household level to mitigate the impacts of flooding, especially if you know you're in a low-lying area. But we have a responsibility here too. We need to show people what we're doing, and we need to kind of step out ahead, and we also need to provide support and advice. Partnerships, of course, we work really closely with the province and with the federal government, and also with nonprofit organizations like the Nashwaak Watershed Association to try and get projects up off the ground and to keep the flow of information going and learning going. So just really quickly before I get into what we've been doing, I just want to pause and talk about adaptation in general. So adaptation is basically a process where we take initiatives and actions that respond to actual or projected changes in climate. So some of the things we're doing are to deal with today problems, so flooding and issues we see today, and some of the actions we take are preventative or proactive because we know with the modeling that they're going to become an issue, and our infrastructure lasts a long time. So if we're not replacing it the right way now, then we're going to be in trouble. So we need to think ahead to the future when we're planning our infrastructure and services. And our overall goal when we did the adaptation plan, and especially around the flooding, is to reduce risk and to reduce the effects of climate impacts. So when you're in the adaptation space, you're basically managing the unavoidable. So climate change mitigation is a different story. You know, we're decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. We're trying to create a better future and make sure that climate change doesn't get too bad. Adaptation, it's kind of the acceptance that regardless of what we do now, there are going to be some changes and there's risk associated with that. So we need to manage that. So we've been taking action on the adaptation file around flooding for over 2 decades. So the actions broadly fall into our operations, our service delivery, our infrastructure renewal, and asset management. And like I went through already, we've focused on leadership and partnerships and community education and engagement. So if we look at some of the challenges, river flooding. So we know that the flooding patterns or mechanisms behind St. John River flooding and Nashwaak River flooding are different. And that's an important learning that happened over time, that there's different mechanisms there. And we need to be aware of that when we're planning how we respond. We're tidal still in Fredericton, so the impacts of sea level rise do come all the way back through to Fredericton. So luckily we have the, in St. John, the reversing falls kind of mitigates that impact a little bit, but we do see a tidal impact in the river up to Fredericton. And then localized flooding, of course, we see high intensity rainfall events, which, you know, they're difficult to plan for, and we need to structure our infrastructure accordingly. One of the other challenges that we face is topography and soil types. So topography, obviously, there's a lot of low-lying areas in Fredericton, especially near the river. It's an issue. But combined with that is the soil types. So we have a lot of sandy or porous soil types, especially near the rivers. So you see not only overland flooding from the river, but you see it coming up through the soil as well. And that's a huge issue, and that's a lot more difficult to adapt for or work around than some of our other issues. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we have done. Like I said, we've improved our understanding of flooding mechanisms over time. So the differences between the 2 major rivers in the city. We've understood, you know, the impact of those soil types and the topography. So we're starting to have a lot better understanding of how that works. We've developed operational flood maps. So to make the distinction here, the province has and is working on renewing flood prediction mapping, which basically shows, you know, what they think is possible in terms of flooding. The city has developed operational flood maps. So basically what we've done is modeled out, or the team has modeled out, you know, what happens at an 8.3, what happens at an 8.5, what happens at an 8.6, who is at risk, what infrastructure is at risk. And those are done all the way up to a 9-meter flood. So there's a pretty good understanding there at this point of what the risk areas are and what the major risks are depending on flood level. We've raised a lot of key sections of roadway, and this is an important piece. It may seem like a simple act, but there's a few components to this. One, our roadways are obviously key for emergency vehicles. It's key for keeping business as usual when we have flooding. But also when those key sections are raised, often the infrastructure underneath is being renewed as well. So we see a renewal of storm and sewer assets, and that includes the oversizing of stormwater assets to be able to be sized correctly for 1 in 100-year flood events, plus 20% for climate change. And then you're seeing valving in key areas when that's being renewed as well, which allows the control of the floodwaters. Again, I think I mentioned we established minimum elevation for habitable space, so 9 meters in low-lying areas, which is really, really important. Obviously, there is a lot of housing within the city that was built before that was in place, and we do see flooding and significant flooding in some of those areas. We've improved options for travel during periods of flooding. So like I mentioned, at a service level, we've adapted the way that busing is done, and we've created park and rides and tried to get people back and forth across the river. I think in 2018 when we had the flood, it was just insane, the amount of traffic, people trying to get on and off the bridge with one way on and one way off, and people trying to get where they needed to go, especially with the waters up for 10 days. The second year it was a lot better. People managed a lot better. We had the transportation there the first year as well, but it took time for people to catch on to that, to adjust to that, and also to adjust their schedules accordingly. But that's something that's been a huge improvement as far as service delivery, and doesn't solve the problem, but it allows us to work around it in that short period. Improving communications leading up to and during periods of flooding. So this is something our emergency measures has worked on a lot, is doing briefings and working with the provincial EMO, and that's evolved over time as they've learned. And along that same thread, improving our emergency preparedness and response planning. So, you know, just unfortunately with experience, getting better at this and understanding the risks and understanding residents' needs and what we can do to respond, and also understanding what the projections are moving forward has really helped with that emergency preparedness and response planning. I'm going to try to play a video here for you. It's a quick video that was done a couple of years ago with city staff. Just let me know if you can't hear it. Sometimes I've presented this before, and sometimes we have issues and sometimes we don't. So we will see what happens. Good. Can we hear it?
No, there's no sound.
Okay, no sound. Okay, that's okay. I will share this video with you guys after, and there's another one in here as well. So one goes up over our adaptation planning in general, and it talks about the river flooding a little bit, and then there's another video that focuses on stormwater infrastructure and management.
Brittany, if you'd like to try, apparently you can share your screen and choose to share your audio. So it's something that you have to click.
Okay. Doesn't seem like I can share both. But let's see. Okay, we'll try that one more time. Can we hear it now? Any sound? No, okay. All right, I will share that with everyone, but we'll move on for now. You can see my PowerPoint though?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we'll talk about localized flooding then. So there's been a lot of work done to include climate change projections in annual infrastructure renewal. And Fredericton's a national leader on this. Really early on, the city worked with the University of Waterloo, the Intact Center, and a whole bunch of different partners to understand what the right sizing was for stormwater infrastructure. And so we went with a 1 in 100 year plus 20% capacity. And that's been working quite well. And so whenever there is infrastructure renewal, that's kind of the standard sizing that we go with now in key areas where there's issues. And that's a really, really important step, I think. It, of course, is expensive, and it's one of those ongoing things, which I think when we really talk about adaptation, we talk about flood resilience, it's not a one-off anyway, right? It's that, you know, we're doing it over and over again. We're incrementally changing our infrastructure and working towards, better assets and better protection from flooding. But at the same time, it's expensive and things continue to change, right? So we're always trying to stay ahead, but there are these big, expensive, difficult pieces that really take time. So we have a separated sanitary and storm sewer systems, which not every city has the benefit of having, and that's historical. So good forward thinking, I think. I don't know if the rationale behind that was flooding, probably not, but we're lucky to have it. And then, so I guess I talked about the major system being 1.2 times a 1 in 100 year event. The minor system is a 1 in 10. So that's, in the neighborhood level. And in a lot of cities, that's a 1 in 2 or 1 in 5. So we're doing well there as well as we renew. This is just a small map that shows, what the upgrades have been over the past couple of decades. And so the map shows, I think, from 2000 to 2013, and then I've added some information about 2014 to 2019. So on there, you see some locations of different stormwater upgrades. So that's your the infrastructure, some valving, the creation of some attenuation ponds, removal of culverts in some places, and then some ditching upgrades, things like that. So they're spread out across the city. And like I said, they've been done over time. Some other ways we've adapted on the localized flooding, stormwater guidelines. So we require net zero runoff for new developments. And those guidelines reflect more severe weather. And those are being looked at all the time. Are we still in the right spot for those? Are those guidelines being followed properly to ensure that we're not overwhelming the systems? Especially, we're seeing a lot of infill development, really great for climate change mitigation, but we need to be careful on the flooding and adaptation side that we're not overwhelming any systems. Attenuation ponds, of course, to help with the stormwater system, stormwater diversions, and again, there's been a number of studies on improving our understanding of our sewer sheds and topography. And over the last 2 decades, the city has, like I said, partnered with industry experts. So we've leveraged our system and infrastructure knowledge in the engineering department and worked on a number of projects. That group has with the Insurance Bureau of Canada. They've helped with the municipal risk assessment tool. We've been involved in the ICLEI BARC program for a long time. So that's a building adaptive and resilience community framework, and that's a way of assessing climate risk. Partnerships with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction and the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. And there's been a lot of sharing of knowledge from the city with other municipalities and with various industry and municipal associations. We'll skip over the video. And I'll talk about what we're working on right now. So you may have heard back in 2019, I believe it was, we're awarded with Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation funding from Infrastructure Canada. And that was a fund that had a minimum $20 million threshold for a project. We, I believe, submitted $28 million worth of work. Most cities are working on one major infrastructure project. We made a pitch to Infrastructure Canada to work on multiple projects throughout the city to deal with river and overland flooding from high intensity rainfall events. And we categorize those into 4 key areas: key transportation infrastructure. So, that looks again at road raising. And it also looks at what's under there as well, renewing storm and sewer assets and looking at valving to further mitigate flooding issues. There's some berming in there. We've looked at municipal infrastructure, so core infrastructure like our lift stations, but also protecting the downtown infrastructure. And we'll see a lot of that protected when we do some of that key transportation infrastructure work. Local watershed resilience. So this is mostly in the upper Brookside West watershed. So we're seeing a lot of development pressure up there. And how do we work with natural infrastructure to create resilience in that area so we're not getting downstream pressure during high intensity rainfall events, because we have the lower watershed there where the stormwater infrastructure really can't be upsized anymore because of the way things are laid out. So we're seeing what we can do in the upper area with natural infrastructure at this point. And then property flood risk mitigation. So this is looking at if there's areas that where we can reduce flood risk in neighborhoods. Again, this kind of taps back into some of that key transportation infrastructure where we'd look at road raises, stormwater infrastructure and valving. And so again, that's kind of, you know, you have that primary benefit of keeping the roadways open during a flood, but then you have that secondary benefit where those things are raised and infrastructure is oversized, where you may actually see less flooding of individual properties. So that work is underway. There have been a couple of small projects that have started. We're really going to get into it next year, and that funding will go until 2028. And we'll continue to do projects throughout that time period. We're also working on a citywide flood risk profile. So City of Ottawa developed with a consultant flood risk profiling methodology for storm and sanitary sewers at an individual property level. And the city started working with a consultant last year to adapt that for here. And the engineering team worked with them to plan to develop a planning tool to support sustainable development in at-risk areas. So again, it's looking at some of those areas where we know we have issues in the system and figuring out ways that we can mitigate that risk. So phase 1 was completed back in 2020. Phase 2 is beginning hopefully this year. We're pending funding, but we want to take a closer look at some of the at-risk areas and try to see where, in addition to gray infrastructure, where natural infrastructure can be of benefit. And then there's a continuation. Like I said, this is kind of an ongoing iterative process for us. So continuing with the infrastructure renewal, continuing with research, partnerships, and education, continuing to update and enhance our asset management plan. So we're going through an asset management renewal. This year, we're starting with buildings, but the goal is to do everything over the next couple of years. And within that, we'll be updating the policy to further reflect the impacts of climate change. There's some wording and language in there now, but we need to put some more risk-based wording in there. And then continuing to update our emergency preparedness and response planning. So that's also an iterative process as we learn more. So where we're headed. So like I said, it's an incremental process. We're going to keep doing this work. Every once in a while, there's new solutions, but there's also the things that we know work that just need to happen over time. So we're staying up to date on best practices, science, and projections. So again, that comes back to our partnerships and working with researchers and folks that have this knowledge, working with our nonprofit organizations who have this knowledge. And then again, continuing to adapt our response. And we're trying to leverage technology and innovation in the field. There's all kinds of ideas coming at us, and I think making sense of what's feasible and what's beneficial right now is becoming more and more of a priority. So we're seeing, you know, things like flood sensors and stuff becoming available at, you know, at the watershed level and at the individual neighborhood level. So what impact could technologies have like that on our flooding response? So we're starting to ask those questions. And that's what I have for for you. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm also just going to completely call out Jody Boone, who's an engineer here at the City of Fredericton. He's on the line as well. So if you have any really in-depth engineering questions that I can't answer, it's possible that, that Jody can.